I died once, or so they told me, and in that death I lost everything I had ever been. My name, my child, my place in the world, all of it slipped through my fingers like water through a cracked vessel. And when I woke again, I was no one. The memory of that February morning returns to me now like a fever dream. I was 23 years old, heavy with child, and my husband Thomas had been dead for 4 months. The letter from the War Office had arrived on a Tuesday, and I remember thinking how ordinary that day had been until I opened it. He was gone. The captain who had married me in haste before shipping off to a war he would never return from, the man who had given me his name and his child, but never his full heart, had fallen somewhere on a battlefield I could not pronounce. I was left with nothing but a swelling belly and a marriage certificate that felt as thin as the paper it was written on. I had no family to speak of. My mother had died giving birth to me, and my father, a country vicar of modest means, had followed her to the grave when I was 17. What I did have was a half-sister, Cecilia, born from my father's brief second marriage to a widow who had brought her own daughter into our household. We were never close, Cecilia and I. She was older by 3 years and possessed a sharp beauty that drew the eye, while I was told I had the kind of face that took time to appreciate. She resented me for reasons I never fully understood, perhaps because my father had loved my mother until his last breath and had never looked at her mother the same way. Still, when I found myself widowed and desperate, it was to Cecilia I turned. She had married a merchant who had died of fever, leaving her with a modest inheritance and a hunger for something more. I wrote to her from the small cottage where Thomas and I had spent our brief months together, and she answered with an invitation to stay with her in the village of Thornfield, not far from the great estate of Ashworth. I accepted because I had no other choice. I did not know then what I was walking into. The journey to Thornfield was long and exhausting. The roads were poor, the weather bitter, and my condition made every jolt of the carriage feel like a blow to my body. By the time I arrived at Cecilia's door, I was feverish and weak. She received me with a smile that did not reach her eyes and led me to a small room at the back of her house, where the fire burned low and the window looked out onto nothing but a gray winter sky. I remember very little of the weeks that followed. The fever took hold of me with a viciousness that frightened even the local physician, a kind old man named Dr. Hartley, who came to see me every day with a grave expression and words of cautious hope. I slipped in and out of consciousness, dreaming of Thomas, of my father, of a child crying somewhere in the darkness that I could not reach. I was told later that I gave birth during one of these fevered nights, that I screamed for hours, and that the child came into the world silent before finally letting out a thin, reedy cry that signaled her survival. A girl. I had a daughter, and I did not even know it. They told me I nearly died that night, that my heart stopped twice, and that Dr. Hartley had to fight to bring me back. What they did not tell me, what I would not learn until years later, was that Cecilia had already begun her theft. While I lay between life and death, she had gone through my belongings and taken my marriage certificate, the letter from Thomas's commanding officer confirming his death, and the small portrait of him that I had kept close to my heart. She took my name, my widowhood, my very identity, and she wore them like a costume she had been waiting her whole life to put on. When I finally woke, I did not know who I was. The fever had burned something out of me, some essential thread that connected my present to my past. I looked at Cecilia and did not recognize her. I looked at my own hands and could not remember whose they were. Dr. Hartley examined me with sorrow in his eyes and told me that such things sometimes happened after a difficult birth, that the mind, overwhelmed by pain and fever, simply retreated into itself. He said the memories might return in time. He said I must be patient. Cecilia told me I was a servant girl named Mary who had come to work for her and had fallen ill. She told me the baby I had born was dead. She told me I had no family, no past, no claim to anything in this world but her charity, And I, lost in the fog of my own broken mind, believed her. She sent me away within the month. A family of farmers in a distant village, the Hendersons, had agreed to take me in as a laborer in exchange for room and board. I was too weak to object, too confused to question why a mistress would send away a servant who had served her faithfully. I went because I had nowhere else to go. I spent 5 years in that village, 5 years of milking cows and mending fences and scrubbing floors until my hands were raw. The Hendersons were not cruel, but they were not kind either. They saw me as a burden, a mouth to feed in exchange for labor that I was often too frail to perform well. I had no name but the one Cecilia had given me, no history but the fragments she had allowed me to keep. I was a ghost walking through a life that did not belong to me, and yet, even in that emptiness, something stirred. There were nights when I would wake with tears on my face and the echo of a cry in my ears, a baby's cry, high and desperate and impossibly familiar. There were moments when a scent or a sound would stop me in my tracks, filling me with a longing I could not name. I dreamed of a man with kind eyes and a sad smile, of a stone church where candles flickered in the dim light, of a hand slipping a ring onto my finger. I did not know if these were memories or fantasies, but I held on to them like a drowning woman holds on to driftwood. The memories began to return in my 5th year at the Henderson farm. It started with small things, a melody I heard at the village fair that I somehow knew all the words to. The way the light fell through the window one autumn afternoon that reminded me of another window in another place, a name spoken in passing that made my heart clench with recognition. Thomas. The name was Thomas, and he had been my husband, and I had loved him even though he had never fully loved me back. The floodgates opened slowly, but relentlessly. Night after night, I lay awake as the pieces of my life reassembled themselves in my mind. I remembered my father's study, the smell of old books and pipe tobacco. I remembered my wedding day, the nervous joy and the quiet fear. I remembered Cecilia's smile when I arrived at her door, the way her eyes had flickered to my belly with something that was not concern but calculation. I remembered the pain of childbirth, the sound of my own screaming, and then a cry, a baby's cry, my baby's cry, before everything went dark. My daughter was alive. I knew it with a certainty that went beyond memory, beyond reason. Cecilia had lied to me. She had taken my child along with everything else, and somewhere in this world, my daughter was living without knowing that her mother was still alive. The weight of this knowledge was almost unbearable. I would lie awake at night, staring at the low wooden ceiling of the barn where I slept, and I would whisper her name into the darkness, the name I had chosen for her before she was born. Lily. I had wanted to name her Lily because my mother had loved lilies, because they bloomed white and pure even in the harshest conditions, because I had hoped my daughter would be like that, resilient and beautiful and strong. Had Cecilia kept the name, or had she changed that too? Had she erased every trace of me from my own child's life? I left the Henderson farm on a cold morning in March, with nothing but the clothes on my back and a handful of coins I had saved over the years. I did not know where Cecilia was or what had become of my child, but I knew where to start looking. The estate of Ashworth. Thomas had spoken of it once, in one of his rare unguarded moments. His cousin, the Duke of Ashworth, was a cold and solitary man who had been contracted by their families to marry Thomas's widow should anything happen to him. It was an old arrangement, a relic of a time when alliances between families were sealed with promises written in blood. Thomas had laughed when he told me, as though the idea of me becoming a duchess was absurd. I had laughed too, because it was absurd, because I was a vicar's daughter with no fortune and no connections, and the Duke of Ashworth was one of the wealthiest men in England. But Cecilia had known about the contract. She had been there when Thomas mentioned it, sitting in the corner of the room with her needlework and her listening ears. She had known that the widow of Captain Thomas Ashford was entitled to the protection and provision of the Duke of Ashworth, and she had seen an opportunity that her hungry heart could not resist. The journey to Ashworth took 3 days by public coach and another half-day on foot. The roads were crowded with merchants and farmers, and I kept my head down, afraid that someone might recognize me, though I could not say who would. I ate sparingly, saving what little money I had for the uncertainty that lay ahead. At night, I slept in coaching inns where the beds were hard and the walls thin, and I listened to the sounds of strangers living their lives around me while I lay in the darkness, planning what I would say when I finally reached my destination. I arrived at the edge of the estate as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns and the grand facade of the manor house. It was larger than anything I had ever seen, a monument to wealth and power that made me feel small and insignificant. The windows caught the dying light and blazed like golden eyes watching my approach. I could smell wood smoke and late winter flowers, and somewhere in the distance, a dog was barking. I stood at the gates for a long time, gathering the courage to walk through them, feeling the cold seep into my bones as the last warmth of the sun disappeared beyond the horizon. What would I say? Who would believe me? I was a ragged woman with no proof of my identity, claiming to be the true wife of a duke who had been married to another woman for 5 years. Cecilia would deny everything. She would call me a mad woman, an impostor, a fortune hunter, and the duke, whoever he was, would have no reason to believe a stranger over the woman who had shared his home and his bed. But my daughter was in that house. I could feel it in my bones. The same way I had felt her presence all those years in the village, the same way I had heard her cry in my dreams. She was there, and I would not leave without her. I walked through the gates as darkness fell. The servants who answered the door looked at me with suspicion and barely concealed disgust. I was dirty from the road, my hair tangled, my dress torn in places. I asked to see the Duke and was told that His Grace did not receive visitors without an appointment. I asked to see the Duchess and was told that Her Grace was indisposed. I asked to see the child of the house and was told, with a sharpness that made my heart stop, that there was no child to see, no child. The words hit me like a physical blow. Had I been wrong? Had my memories deceived me after all? And then I heard it. A laugh, high and bright, and unmistakably a child's laugh, coming from somewhere deep within the house. I pushed past the servants and ran toward the sound, ignoring their shouts of protest. I ran through corridors I did not know, past paintings and tapestries and suits of armor, following that laugh like a thread through a labyrinth. I found her in the library. She was sitting on the floor by the fireplace, a book open in her lap, her dark hair falling in waves around her face. The firelight caught the curve of her cheek, the small determined set of her mouth, the way her fingers traced the words on the page with the careful attention of a child just learning to read. She looked up when I burst through the door, and I saw my own eyes looking back at me. My mother's eyes, the same shade of deep brown that I saw every time I looked in a mirror. My father's nose, slightly too long for her small face. Thomas's stubborn chin, the one feature of his that I had always secretly loved. She was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen, and she did not know me at all. The servants caught up with me then. They grabbed my arms and pulled me back, apologizing profusely to someone I could not see. I fought against them, calling out to the child, calling her by a name I did not even know, telling her that I was her mother, that I had come to take her home. And then a voice, cold and sharp as a winter wind, cut through the chaos. Who is this woman, and why is she in my house? I looked up and saw him for the first time. The Duke of Ashworth. He was tall and dark, with a face that might have been handsome if it were not so completely devoid of warmth. His eyes, gray as storm clouds, regarded me with a mixture of irritation and contempt. He stood in the doorway with the bearing of a man who had never been challenged in his own home, never been questioned, never been told that his reality was built on a foundation of lies. His coat was immaculate, his cravat perfectly tied, every detail of his appearance speaking to a life of order and control. He looked at me as though I were an insect that had wandered into his drawing room, something to be removed and forgotten. "I am Eleanor Ashford," I said, my voice trembling but clear. "I am the widow of Captain Thomas Ashford, and that child is my daughter." The silence that followed was absolute. The servants stopped struggling. The child looked up with wide, confused eyes. And the Duke, the man who had unknowingly married an impostor and raised another woman's child, stared at me as though I had just told him the sky was green. "That is impossible," he said finally. "My wife is Eleanor Ashford." "No," I said. "Your wife is my half-sister, Cecilia. She stole my identity when I was too ill to stop her. She has been lying to you for 5 years." He did not believe me. I could see it in the set of his jaw, the coldness in his eyes. He gestured to the servants to remove me, and they dragged me toward the door as I screamed and pleaded for him to listen, to look at the child, to see the truth that was written in her face. The last thing I saw before they threw me out into the night was my daughter, standing in the doorway of the library, watching me with those eyes that were so like my own. And in that moment, I knew that I would never stop fighting to get her back. They left me on the gravel drive like a piece of refuse, and I lay there in the darkness listening to the great doors of Ashworth close behind me with a sound like a tomb sealing shut. The cold seeped into my bones as I pushed myself upright. My hands were scraped from the fall, my dress torn at the hem, and somewhere in the struggle I had lost one of my shoes. I looked back at the house, at its blazing windows and its impenetrable walls, and I felt a despair so profound that for a moment I could not breathe. My daughter was in there. She was alive. She was real. And she had looked at me with the polite confusion of a child regarding a stranger. I did not leave the estate that night. I could not. Instead, I walked to the edge of the property where a small copse of trees offered some shelter from the wind, and I curled myself into the hollow between 2 ancient oaks. The ground was cold and damp, but I had slept in worse places during my years at the Henderson farm. I closed my eyes and tried to hold on to the image of my daughter's face, the way the firelight had caught in her dark hair, the book open in her small hands. Lily. I was certain now that Cecilia had kept the name. I had heard one of the servants say it as they dragged me through the corridors. "Miss Lily is in the library." The words had pierced my heart like a blade. I must have slept, because when I opened my eyes again, the sky was gray with dawn, and my entire body ached with cold. I rose stiffly and made my way to the village I had passed through the day before, a small cluster of cottages and shops that existed in the shadow of the great estate. The villagers looked at me with suspicion as I walked through their streets, and I could not blame them. I was a ragged stranger with wild eyes and no explanation for my presence. I found work at the village inn, a modest establishment called the King's Arms that catered to travelers and local farmhands alike. The innkeeper, a stout woman named Mrs. Bramley, took one look at me and saw what I was, a desperate woman with nowhere else to go. She offered me a position scrubbing floors and washing linens in exchange for a room in the attic and 2 meals a day. It was not much, but it was enough to keep me close to Ashworth, close to my daughter, close to the truth that I was determined to uncover. The villagers talked, as villagers always do. Within a week of my arrival, I had learned more about the household at Ashworth than I could have discovered in a month of direct inquiry. The Duke, I learned, was a cold and distant man who had married the widow of his cousin 5 years ago in fulfillment of a family contract. He was said to be devoted to duty, but incapable of warmth. A man who ran his estate with precision, but showed little affection for anyone, including his wife. The Duchess, on the other hand, was considered charming and gracious, a beautiful woman who had brought life and laughter to a house that had been silent for too long. She was beloved by the servants and admired by the gentry, and no one had ever questioned her right to be there. And then there was the child. Miss Lily, they called her, The Duke's stepdaughter, the daughter of the late Captain Ashford. She was a quiet girl, by all accounts, prone to daydreaming and often found alone in the library or the gardens. The servants doted on her, but there were whispers that the Duchess kept her at a distance, that she treated her own daughter with a coolness that seemed unnatural. Some said it was because the child reminded her too much of her dead husband. Others said the Duchess was simply not the maternal type. I knew the truth, of course. Cecilia kept Lily at a distance because Lily was not her daughter. Every time she looked at that child, she saw the evidence of her own deception staring back at her. I bided my time. I scrubbed floors and washed linens and listened to every scrap of gossip that came my way. I learned the rhythms of the household when the Duke rode out on his morning inspections, when the Duchess took her carriage to visit neighbors, when the child was allowed to play in the gardens that bordered the public road. And one afternoon, nearly 2 weeks after my arrival, I saw my opportunity. Lily was alone in the garden, picking flowers near the low stone wall that separated the estate from the lane. Her governess was nowhere to be seen, likely called away on some errand, or perhaps simply negligent in her duties. I approached slowly, my heart pounding so loudly I was certain she would hear it. She looked up as I drew near, and once again I was struck by the familiarity of her face, the echo of my own features in her soft cheeks and determined brow. "Hello," I said, keeping my voice gentle. "Those are very pretty flowers." She regarded me with the wary curiosity of a child who has been taught not to speak to strangers. "Thank you," she said politely. "I am making a bouquet for my governess. She is unwell today." "That is very kind of you," I said. I knelt down so that I was at her level, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes. "What is your name?" "Lily," she said. "Lily Ashford. What is yours?" The question caught me off guard. I had not thought about what name to give, what identity to assume in this strange half-life I was living. For a moment, I considered telling her the truth, but I knew that would only frighten her and alert the household to my presence. So instead, I said the first name that came to mind, the name Cecilia had given me all those years ago. "Mary," I said. "My name is Mary." She nodded solemnly, accepting this information with the seriousness of a child who understands that names are important. "Do you live in the village, Mary?" "I do now," I said. "I work at the inn, but I used to live far away, in a place where the winters were very cold and the summers were very short." "That sounds dreadful," she said with a small frown. "I would not like to live in such a place." "It was not so bad," I said, smiling despite myself. "I had someone I loved very much there with me, and that made everything bearable." Her eyes widened with interest. "Who was it? A husband?" "No," I said, and my voice caught on the word. "A daughter. I had a daughter once, but I lost her." The child's face softened with a sympathy that seemed too mature for her years. "I am sorry," she said. "That must have been very sad." "It was," I said. "It still is, but I have not given up hope of finding her again." She was quiet for a moment, considering this. Then she reached out and placed one of her flowers in my hand, a small white bloom with petals as soft as silk. "This is for you," she said, "so you will not be so sad." I looked at the flower in my palm, and I felt tears burning behind my eyes. She did not know me, could not know me, and yet in that simple gesture of kindness, she had given me more comfort than I had received in 5 years of wandering. I wanted to tell her everything, to gather her in my arms and never let go, but I knew that I could not. Not yet. Not until I had proof that would make even the coldest skeptic believe. "Thank you, Lily," I said. "I will treasure it always." A voice called from the house then, sharp and impatient, and Lily's face clouded with something that looked like resignation. "I must go," she said. "That is my mother calling." The word struck me like a blow. Mother. Cecilia had stolen even that from me, the right to be called by my own child's name for me. I watched as Lily gathered her flowers and ran toward the house. her small figure growing smaller until she disappeared through a door in the garden wall. I stood there for a long time after she was gone, holding the white flower in my hand and trying to remember how to breathe. The next days were agony. I threw myself into my work at the inn, scrubbing and cleaning until my hands were raw, trying to exhaust my body so that my mind would stop its endless churning. But every night, when I lay in my narrow bed in the attic, I saw Lily's face behind my closed eyes, heard her voice saying, "My mother is calling," felt the weight of the flower she had placed in my hand. I pressed that flower between the pages of an old Bible I found in the inn's common room, and I looked at it every morning before I began my work, reminding myself why I was there and what I was fighting for. It was during this time that I began to notice something strange. The Duke had taken to riding through the village more often than before, his gray horse picking its way carefully along the cobbled streets while his gray eyes scanned the faces of the villagers. At first I thought nothing of it, assumed it was merely part of his duties as the local landlord. But then I realized that his gaze lingered on me longer than on the others, that he seemed to be watching me with an intensity that made my skin prickle with unease. I did not know what it meant. Had Cecilia told him about my intrusion? Had he come to ensure that I was gone? That the mad woman who had claimed to be his true wife had been driven from the area? Or was there something else, some flicker of doubt that had taken root in his mind and refused to be extinguished? The answer came on a rain-soaked evening, nearly 3 weeks after my arrival in the village. I was alone in the inn's kitchen, scrubbing pots by the light of a single candle, when the door opened and a figure stepped inside. I looked up, expecting to see Mrs. Bramley come to check on my progress, and instead found myself staring into the cold gray eyes of the Duke of Ashworth. He stood in the doorway, the rain dripping from his greatcoat and pooling on the flagstones at his feet. His face was as unreadable as it had been on the night we first met, but there was something different in his bearing, a tension that suggested he was not entirely certain of his purpose here. "You," he said, and his voice was quiet, but carried an edge of command that made me straighten despite myself. "You are the woman who came to my house, the one who claimed to be Eleanor Ashford." I set down the pot I had been scrubbing and wiped my hands on my apron. "I did not claim to be her, Your Grace," I said, keeping my voice steady even though my heart was racing. "I am her." His jaw tightened. "My wife is Eleanor Ashford. I have been married to her for 5 years. You have been married to my half-sister Cecilia for 5 years," I said. "She took my identity when I was too ill to stop her. She stole my marriage certificate, my husband's letters, everything that proved who I was. And she took my daughter." He stared at me for a long moment, and I could see the war playing out behind his eyes. He wanted to dismiss me, to call me a liar and a fortune hunter and walk out of this kitchen without looking back. But something was stopping him. Something I had said, or perhaps something he had noticed on his own, some inconsistency in the woman he had married that he could not explain. "Why should I believe you?" he asked finally. "You have no proof. You have nothing but your word against the word of my wife." "I have the truth," I said, "and I have my daughter's face, which is the mirror of my own. Look at her, Your Grace. Look at her eyes, her nose, the shape of her mouth. Then look at your wife and tell me that child came from her body. Tell me that, and I will leave this place and never return." The silence stretched between us, heavy and charged. I could hear the rain drumming on the roof, the crackle of the fire in the hearth, the pounding of my own blood in my ears. He did not speak for what felt like an eternity, and when he finally did, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I have looked," he said, "and I have wondered." My breath caught in my throat. "You believe me?" "I believe nothing," he said sharply, "but I am not a fool. There are questions that require answers, inconsistencies that demand explanation." He paused, his gaze boring into mine. "I will investigate this matter. I will uncover the truth, whatever it may be. And if I find that you have lied to me, If this is some scheme to extort money or position from my household, I will destroy you so completely that no one will remember you ever existed." I met his gaze without flinching. "And if you find that I have told the truth? If you find that your wife is the liar, and I am who I say I am?" He did not answer. Instead, he turned and walked out into the rain, leaving the door swinging open behind him. I watched him go, watched his tall figure disappear into the darkness, and I felt something I had not allowed myself to feel in 5 long years. Hope. The Duke began his investigation the following day. I did not see him again, but I heard the whispers that rippled through the village like wind through wheat. He had sent for documents, they said. He had written letters to distant parishes and military offices. He had summoned the old physician who had attended his wife during her illness years ago, the same Dr. Hartley who had fought to save my life on the night my daughter was born. I waited. There was nothing else I could do. I scrubbed my floors and washed my linens and visited the garden wall in hopes of seeing Lily again. She came sometimes when her governess was occupied elsewhere, and we would talk through the stones like conspirators in some secret plot. She told me about her lessons and her books and the pony her stepfather had given her for her last birthday. She told me about her mother, how distant she was, how she never seemed to want Lily near her. She told me about the Duke, who frightened her a little, but who sometimes brought her sweets from his study when no one was looking. She never asked why I came to see her. Perhaps she sensed, in the way children sometimes sense things that adults cannot, that there was a connection between us that went deeper than chance encounters at a garden wall. Or perhaps she was simply lonely, a quiet child in a great cold house, hungry for any kindness that was offered freely. And then, on a gray afternoon, nearly a month after the Duke's visit to the inn, a servant came to fetch me. "His Grace requests your presence at Ashworth," the young man said, his face carefully blank. "He asks that you come at once." I set down my scrub brush. My hands were trembling, though whether from fear or anticipation I could not say. I followed the servant out of the inn and up the long drive to the house I had been thrown out of so many weeks before. The doors opened for me this time, and I walked through them with my head held high, though my heart was beating so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. They led me to the drawing room, a vast space filled with silk-covered furniture and gilt-framed paintings of ancestors who stared down at me with cold, aristocratic disdain. The Duke was standing by the fireplace, his face pale and drawn. Beside him, seated on a velvet settee with her hands clasped in her lap, was Cecilia. She looked up when I entered, and I saw the fear that flickered across her face before she masked it with a smile of pure malice. And standing in the corner, clutching a worn leather bag to his chest, was Dr. Hartley. He was older than I remembered, his hair now completely white, his shoulders stooped with age. But his eyes were the same, kind and shrewd and unmistakably honest. The Duke looked at me, then at Cecilia, then back at me. And when he spoke, his voice was as cold and final as the closing of a coffin lid. "Dr. Hartley has completed his examination," he said. "He has confirmed that my wife has never given birth to a child." The room fell silent. I watched the color drain from Cecilia's face, watched her mask of composure crack and crumble as the truth she had buried for 5 years came clawing its way to the surface. And I knew, in that moment, that everything was about to change. Cecilia rose from the settee like a woman who has been struck but refuses to fall, and for a moment I saw in her face the girl I had once known, the half-sister who had resented me from the day we met, but who had also, in her own twisted way, needed me. "This is absurd," she said, her voice pitched high with desperation. "Dr. Hartley is an old man. His memory is failing. He cannot possibly remember details from 5 years ago with any accuracy." Dr. Hartley cleared his throat. He did not look at Cecilia, but kept his gaze fixed on the Duke. His old hands trembled slightly, as he clutched the worn leather bag that contained, I knew now, the evidence of my existence. "I assure your grace that my faculties remain intact," he said, and his voice was steady despite his years. "I have detailed notes from the evening in question, notes that I keep for all my patients. I remember that night as clearly as if it were yesterday, for I nearly lost 2 lives, and I have carried the weight of that memory ever since. The woman I attended, the woman who gave birth to the child you now call Lily, was not the woman seated before you. She was younger, smaller in stature, with hair the color of autumn leaves and eyes that held a gentleness I have rarely seen, and she had a birthmark on her left shoulder in the shape of a crescent moon. I noted it specifically because such marks are often hereditary, and I thought the child might one day bear the same sign." The Duke turned to me. "Show me," he said. I did not hesitate. I reached up and loosened the ties of my dress, pulling the fabric aside just enough to reveal my left shoulder. The birthmark was there, exactly as Dr. Hartley had described, a pale crescent that had been with me since birth. My mother had called it my moon, had told me it meant I was destined for a life of poetry and dreaming. She had kissed that spot every night when she tucked me into bed, and after she died, I would sometimes press my own fingers to it in the darkness, pretending I could still feel the warmth of her lips. I had forgotten that until this moment, and the memory brought tears to my eyes. The Duke stared at the mark for a long moment, then turned back to Cecilia. His face was terrible in its stillness, a mask of controlled fury that made even me take an involuntary step backward. "Explain this," he said. Cecilia's composure crumbled. She began to cry, great heaving sobs that racked her body and made her beautiful face twist into something ugly and desperate. "It was not supposed to happen this way," she said between sobs. "She was dying. Everyone said she was dying. The physician said she would not last the night. I only took the papers because I thought she would never need them again. I thought I was saving myself, saving the child from a life of poverty and obscurity. I thought I was doing the right thing." "You thought you were doing the right thing," the Duke repeated, his voice dripping with contempt. "You stole another woman's identity. You stole her child. You married me under false pretenses and lived in my house as my wife for 5 years. And you dare to claim you thought you were doing the right thing." She reached for him, her hands clawing at his coat. "Please, Edmund, please, you must understand. I loved you. I still love you. Everything I did because I wanted to be with you, because I wanted to give you the life you deserved. She was nobody, a vicar's daughter with nothing to her name. I gave you a wife who could shine in society, who could host your parties and charm your guests and make you proud. Is that not worth something? Is that not worth everything?" The Duke pulled away from her grasp with a violence that made her stumble. "You gave me nothing," he said. "You gave me lies. You gave me a marriage built on deception and a wife who was not who she claimed to be. You gave me years of my life spent with a stranger wearing another woman's face." He turned to look at me then, and something in his expression shifted. It was not warmth, not yet, but it was something close to recognition. The anger in his eyes softened into something more complex, a mixture of grief and confusion, and what might have been the first stirrings of remorse. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, and the name on his lips felt like the first breath after drowning. "I owe you an apology. I owe you far more than that, but an apology is where I must begin." I did not know what to say. I had spent so long preparing for this moment, imagining how it would feel to finally be believed, to finally be acknowledged as who I truly was. But now that it was happening, I felt only a strange emptiness, a hollow space where triumph should have been. "I do not want your apology, Your Grace," I said. "I want my daughter." He nodded slowly. "You shall have her. You shall have everything that was taken from you. But first, there are matters that must be addressed." He turned back to Cecilia, who had collapsed onto the settee and was weeping into her hands. This woman must be removed from my house. She must be held accountable for what she has done. No, I said, and the word surprised even me. Both the Duke and Cecilia looked at me with equal measures of shock. No, the Duke repeated. I looked at my half-sister, at the woman who had stolen everything from me and left me to wander the world like a ghost. I should have hated her. Part of me did hate her, with a fury that burned in my chest like a coal that would never go out. But I also understood her in a way that no one else in that room could. I understood what it was to be hungry for something you could never have, to watch others receive the love and the life you believed should have been yours. I understood what desperation could drive a person to do, even a person who had once been capable of kindness. She is my sister, I said. What she did was wrong, unforgivably wrong, but she is still my sister. I do not want her destroyed. I want only what is mine, my name, my daughter, my place in this world. The rest is between her and God. The Duke stared at me as though seeing me for the first time. For a long moment he did not speak. Then slowly, he nodded. You are a more merciful woman than I would be, Mrs. Ashford, he said. Very well. She will not be prosecuted, but she cannot remain here. She will be sent away somewhere far from England, with enough money to live comfortably, but never enough to return. She will take nothing that belongs to you, and she will have no contact with the child. Is that acceptable? I looked at Cecilia, who was watching me with an expression I could not read. There was fear there, certainly, and resentment, but also something that might have been gratitude. She had expected to be thrown into prison or worse. Instead, I was offering her a way out, a chance to start again in some distant land where no one would know her crimes. It is acceptable, I said. The Duke called for his servants then, and the next hour passed in a blur of activity and arrangements. Cecilia was taken to her chambers to pack a single trunk of belongings, nothing more. She was not permitted to take jewelry or valuables, nothing that had been given to her as the Duchess of Ashworth, for those things had never truly belonged to her. She would leave with the clothes on her back and the modest settlement the Duke had promised, and she would board a ship for the Americas, where she would live out her days in whatever manner she chose. I did not speak to her before she left. There was nothing left to say between us, no words that could bridge the chasm of betrayal that separated us. But as she was led through the great hall toward the waiting carriage, she stopped and turned to look at me one last time. Her face was pale and streaked with tears, her beautiful hair disheveled, her fine gown wrinkled from the ordeal of the evening. She looked, for the first time since I had known her, utterly defeated. I never meant for it to go so far, she said, and her voice was barely a whisper. I only wanted what you had. I only wanted to be loved the way you were loved. I did not respond. What could I have said? That I forgave her? I did not know if that was true. That I understood her? I did, but understanding is not the same as absolution. I simply watched as she was led out into the night, watched as the carriage door closed behind her, watched until the vehicle pulled away, watched until it disappeared around the bend in the drive and was swallowed by the gathering dusk. I did not know if I would ever see her again. I did not know if I wanted to. When I turned back to the room, the Duke was watching me with that same unreadable expression. There is someone who wishes to meet you, he said. Someone who has been asking about the woman with the flower. My heart seized in my chest. Lily. He led me through the corridors of Ashworth, past the library where I had first seen my daughter, past the drawing rooms and the galleries and the endless parade of ancestral portraits. We climbed a staircase I had not noticed before, narrow and winding, and at the top we came to a door painted the soft blue of a summer sky. She is in there, the Duke said. She knows that something has happened, that her mother has gone away. I have not told her why. I thought perhaps that should come from you. I stood before that blue door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. Behind it was everything I had lost. everything I had spent 5 years searching for. Behind it was my daughter, my Lily, the child I had brought into this world and then been forced to abandon. What would I say to her? How could I possibly explain what had happened? Why she had grown up thinking another woman was her mother? Why I had not come for her sooner? I opened the door. The nursery was warm and bright, filled with toys and books and the soft glow of firelight. Lily was sitting by the window, a doll clutched in her arms, looking out at the darkness that had fallen over the gardens. She turned when she heard me enter, and once again I was struck by the miracle of her face, the living proof that I had loved and been loved, that I had created something beautiful, despite all the ugliness that had followed. "Mary," she said, and then she stopped, confusion flickering across her features. "But you look different. You are wearing a fine dress. I had not even noticed. Someone, perhaps a kind servant or the Duke himself, had provided me with clothing more suitable for the mistress of a great house than for a scullery maid. I was wearing silk for the first time in 5 years, and the fabric felt strange against my skin, too soft, too luxurious, as though I were wearing someone else's life. I knelt down before her, bringing my face level with hers. "My name is not Mary," I said softly. "My name is Eleanor Ashford, and I am your mother." She stared at me, her eyes wide and uncomprehending. "But my mother has gone away," she said. "The servant said she had to leave and that she would not be coming back." "The woman who left was not your mother," I said. "She was my sister, and she took something that did not belong to her. She took you, Lily. She took you from me when you were just a baby, and I have been looking for you ever since." Lily was silent for a long moment. I could see her young mind working, trying to make sense of what I was telling her, trying to reconcile this new information with everything she had believed to be true. Then she looked at me with those eyes, my eyes, and she asked the question I had been dreading. "If you are my real mother," she said, "then why did you leave me?" The words cut deeper than any blade. I reached out and took her small hands in mine, and I told her the truth as gently as I could. I told her about the fever that had stolen my memories, about the years I had spent lost and confused, about the slow return of everything I had forgotten. I told her about the flower she had given me at the garden wall, and how I had pressed it in a Bible and looked at it every day, drawing strength from that small act of kindness. "I never left you," I said, my voice breaking. "I was taken from you, and every day that I was gone, some part of me was searching for you, even when I did not know what I was searching for. I loved you before you were born, Lily. I loved you when I could not remember my own name. And I love you now more than I could ever put into words." She was crying. We both were. The tears streamed down her cheeks and dripped onto our joined hands, and I gathered her into my arms and held her the way I had dreamed of holding her for 5 long years. She was warm and solid and real, and she smelled of lavender soap and wood smoke and something indefinably sweet. She smelled like my daughter. "Will you stay?" she whispered against my shoulder. "Will you stay and be my mother now?" "I will stay," I promised. "I will stay forever. Nothing and no one will ever take me from you again." I do not know how long we remained like that, wrapped in each other's arms as the fire burned low and the candles guttered in their holders. At some point, I became aware of a presence in the doorway, and I looked up to find the Duke watching us with an expression that might have been pain or might have been wonder. He said nothing. He simply stood there, a tall, dark figure silhouetted against the light from the corridor, witnessing the reunion he had made possible with his relentless pursuit of the truth. I thought of how I had hated him that first night, how I had seen nothing in his cold gray eyes but contempt and dismissal. I had been wrong. Beneath that icy exterior was a man who valued honesty above all else, who had risked his reputation and his marriage to uncover a deception that had poisoned his house for half a decade. I wanted to thank him, but the words felt inadequate. So instead, I simply nodded, a small acknowledgement of all that he had done, and after a moment he returned the gesture and withdrew, closing the door softly behind him. That night, I slept in the nursery with my daughter curled against my side, her small body warm and trusting, her breath soft against my neck. I did not dream. For the first time in 5 years, I did not need to. The nightmares that had haunted me, the endless searching through corridors that led nowhere, the crying I could never reach, the faces that dissolved before I could recognize them, all of it was gone. In its place was a peace so profound that I did not know how I had survived without it. But I knew that the story was not over. The truth had been revealed, Cecilia had been banished, and I had my daughter back. Yet there remained questions that had not been answered, wounds that had not been healed. The Duke had believed a lie for 5 years. He had shared his life and his bed with a woman who was not who she claimed to be. He had raised another man's child as his stepdaughter. How would he move forward from such a betrayal? And what would become of me, the true widow of Captain Thomas Ashford, now that I had been restored to my rightful place? I lay in the darkness, listening to my daughter's breathing, and I wondered what tomorrow would bring. The weeks that followed were a strange kind of awakening, like emerging from a long winter into a spring I had forgotten could exist. I was given chambers in the east wing of Ashworth, a suite of rooms that overlooked the rose garden and caught the morning light in a way that made everything seem gilded with possibility. The rooms had belonged to a dowager aunt of the Duke's, long deceased, and they had been preserved in her memory with all their faded elegance intact. I did not mind the old-fashioned furniture or the slightly musty smell of disuse. After 5 years of sleeping in barns and attics, a feather bed and silk curtains felt like an embarrassment of riches. Lily came to me every morning before breakfast, slipping through the connecting door that led from my chambers to the nursery. She would crawl into my bed and nestle against me, and we would lie there together watching the light change on the ceiling while she told me about her dreams. She dreamed of horses and castles, and sometimes of a woman with sad eyes who stood at the edge of a dark forest, calling her name. I knew that woman was me, the ghost of a mother she had somehow remembered even when she could not have known I existed. The bond between us had survived 5 years of separation, and now it was knitting itself back together with a speed that astonished us both. The Duke kept his distance. He was polite when we encountered each other at meals or in the corridors, inquiring after my health and my comfort with the formal courtesy of a man addressing a guest. But there was a barrier between us, invisible yet unmistakable, and I did not know how to breach it. He had been deceived by my sister. He had shared his life with a woman he believed to be me, and now he had to reconcile the stranger he had married with the stranger who had taken her place. I could not imagine how confusing it must have been for him. Looking at me and seeing both the wife he thought he knew and the woman he had never met, I tried to make myself useful. I took over the management of the household, a task that Cecilia had apparently neglected in favor of more glamorous pursuits. The accounts were in disarray, the servants demoralized, the pantry half empty despite the wealth that should have kept it full. I spent my days meeting with the housekeeper and the cook, reviewing ledgers and making lists, restoring order to a house that had been allowed to fall into genteel chaos. It felt good to have a purpose, to be needed for something other than scrubbing floors. The servants were wary of me at first. They had loved Cecilia, or at least they had believed they loved the woman she pretended to be. Learning that their mistress had been an impostor was a shock that rippled through the household like a stone thrown into still water. Some of them looked at me with suspicion, as though I might be an impostor too, another layer of deception in an already tangled web. Others looked at me with pity, this poor woman who had lost everything and was now trying to rebuild her life from the ashes. I did not want their pity. I wanted only their respect, and I knew I would have to earn it. It was Mrs. Blackwood, the housekeeper, who first began to thaw. She was a stern woman with iron-gray hair and a spine like a ramrod, and she had run Ashworth for 30 years with an efficiency that bordered on tyranny. She had served the Duke's mother before him and considered herself the guardian of the family's honor. When I first took over the household accounts, she watched me with barely concealed skepticism, waiting for me to make a mistake that would prove I was not fit for the role I had claimed. But I did not make mistakes. My father had been a vicar, but he had also been a practical man who believed that a woman should know how to manage a household as well as a home. He had taught me mathematics and bookkeeping alongside my letters and my catechism, and those skills had not deserted me despite the years of manual labor. I balanced the accounts, identified the areas of waste, and implemented changes that saved money without sacrificing quality. Mrs. Blackwood watched all of this with growing approval, and one afternoon she came to me with a pot of tea and a plate of biscuits and said, in her gruff way, that she was glad to finally have a proper mistress in the house. It was a small victory, but it meant more to me than I could say. The other servants followed Mrs. Blackwood's lead, as I had known they would. Within a fortnight, they had stopped looking at me with suspicion and started looking at me with something approaching warmth. They learned my preferences, the way I liked my tea and the time I preferred to take my meals. They began to come to me with questions and concerns, treating me as the mistress of the house rather than an interloper who had arrived under scandalous circumstances. I was no longer the madwoman who had burst into the library claiming to be the real Duchess. I was Mrs. Ashford, the widow of Captain Thomas Ashford, the mother of Miss Lily, the rightful lady of Ashworth. The transformation was gradual, but profound. I began to feel as though I belonged here, as though the walls of this great house had somehow recognized me as one of their own. I learned the names of all the servants, from the highest footman to the lowest scullery maid. I learned the rhythms of the household, the times when the kitchens were busiest and the hours when the corridors fell silent. I learned which floorboards creaked and which doors stuck, and where the drafts came in on cold nights. Ashworth was becoming my home in a way that no place had been since my father's vicarage, and I was surprised by how much that meant to me. The days grew longer as spring advanced toward summer. The gardens came alive with color, roses and peonies and sweet-smelling jasmine that perfumed the air whenever the windows were open. Lily and I spent hours exploring the grounds, discovering hidden paths and secret gardens that she had never known existed. She showed me her favorite spots, the old oak tree where she liked to read, the pond where the swans nested every year, the crumbling folly at the edge of the woods where she pretended to be a princess in a fairy tale. I listened to her chatter and marveled at the person she had become, this bright and curious child who had grown up without me, but who had somehow inherited my love of stories and my father's stubborn independence. Sometimes the Duke would join us on our walks. He would appear at the edge of the garden, seemingly by accident, and fall into step beside us as though he had always been there. He did not say much, but he listened to Lily's endless stream of observations and questions with a patience that surprised me. I had thought him cold, incapable of warmth, but I began to see that his reserve was a kind of armor, protection against a world that had disappointed him too many times. Beneath that armor was a man who cared deeply, perhaps too deeply, and who had learned to hide his feelings rather than risk having them used against him. One afternoon, while Lily ran ahead to chase a butterfly, I found myself alone with him for the first time since my arrival. We were standing in the rose garden, surrounded by blooms of every color, and the scent was so overwhelming that it made me slightly dizzy. "You have done wonders with the household," he said, breaking the silence that had stretched between us. "Mrs. Blackwood speaks very highly of you." "Mrs. Blackwood is not easily impressed," I said. "I consider it a great compliment, as you should." He paused, his gray eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the garden wall. "I owe you more than compliments, Mrs. Ashford. I owe you an explanation." I waited, not knowing what he meant to say. "When I married your sister," he said slowly, "I did not do it for love. The contract between our families was clear. I was to provide for the widow of my cousin Thomas, to give her a home and a name and the protection of my house. It was a duty, nothing more. I expected nothing from the arrangement but the satisfaction of having honored my obligations. And yet, I said. And yet, he repeated, 5 years is a long time. I came to believe that I knew her, that beneath the surface of duty there might be something more. She was charming and beautiful, and she seemed to want nothing more than to please me. I thought perhaps that was enough. I thought perhaps love could grow from less promising soil. His voice was heavy with something that sounded like shame. I did not know what to say. I had spent so long hating Cecilia for what she had done, but I had not considered what it must have been like for him, this proud and private man who had been made a fool of in his own home. He had opened himself to the possibility of love, had allowed himself to hope that his marriage might become something more than a contractual obligation, and that hope had been built on a foundation of lies. "It was not your fault," I said. "She deceived everyone. She deceived me when I was too ill to know my own name. She deceived Dr. Hartley and the servants and the whole of society. You cannot blame yourself for believing what everyone else believed. She deceived me because I wanted to be deceived," he said, and there was a bitterness in his voice that cut deeper than anger. I saw the inconsistencies, the moments when her story did not quite make sense. There were times when she would not speak of her first husband, claiming it was too painful, and I accepted that excuse without question. There were times when she looked at Lily with something other than maternal love, something that might have been resentment or fear, and I told myself I was imagining things. I chose to ignore the evidence of my own eyes because the alternative was too painful to contemplate. I chose comfort over truth, and in doing so, I failed you, and I failed your daughter. You found the truth in the end, I said. That is what matters. He turned to look at me then, and there was something in his eyes that made my breath catch. It was not the cold assessment I had grown accustomed to, but something warmer, something searching. "You are not what I expected," he said. "When you first came to my house, I thought you were mad or scheming. I could not imagine that anyone could survive what you survived and remain so whole. But you are whole, Mrs. Ashford. You are stronger than anyone I have ever known." "I have had to be," I said. "There was no other choice. There is always a choice," he said. "Many in your position would have given up. Many would have surrendered to despair and let the world swallow them. You did not. You fought for your daughter, for your name, for yourself. That is not mere survival. That is courage." I did not know how to respond to such praise. No one had ever spoken to me that way, not even Thomas in our brief time together. I felt heat rising to my cheeks and looked away, fixing my gaze on a rose that had begun to drop its petals onto the gravel path. Lily was returning now, clutching a handful of wildflowers she had gathered from the meadow beyond the garden. She ran to the Duke and thrust the flowers toward him with a smile that transformed her whole face. "These are for you," she said. "Mary, I mean Mama," she corrected herself with a slight blush, "told me that flowers can say things we cannot put into words." The Duke took the flowers with a gravity that matched the solemnity of the gift. "And what do these flowers say?" he asked. Lily considered the question. "They say thank you," she said finally, "for being kind to us, for letting us stay." Something shifted in the Duke's face, a crack in the armor he wore so carefully. He knelt down so that he was at Lily's level, the wildflowers clutched in his hand, and he looked at her with an expression that made my heart ache. "You do not need to thank me," he said. "This is your home. It has always been your home, and you may stay as long as you wish." "Forever?" Lily asked. "Forever," he said. She threw her arms around his neck then, a spontaneous embrace that seemed to startle him. He hesitated for a moment, uncertain, and then his arms came up to hold her, and I saw in that gesture everything he had been hiding behind his walls of ice and duty. He loved her. He had been her father in all but blood for 5 years, and he loved her with a fierceness that had nothing to do with obligation. I watched them. This man and this child, who had both been deceived and both been wounded, and I felt something stir in my chest that I had thought long dead. It was not gratitude, though I was grateful. It was not relief, though I was relieved. It was something deeper and more dangerous, a feeling I had buried along with my memories of Thomas and my hopes for a future that had been stolen from me. I recognized it with a start of surprise and something close to fear. It was the first stirring of love, not the desperate, grasping love I had felt for Thomas, who had married me out of duty and left me before we could discover if there might be more between us. This was something different, something that had grown quietly in the spaces between our conversations, in the glances we exchanged across the dinner table, in the way he listened when I spoke, as though my words mattered more than anything else in the world. I did not know what to do with this feeling. I did not know if it was welcome or wise or even possible. He was still technically my husband's cousin, bound to me by a contract that had been fulfilled under false pretenses. The law might say our marriage was void, that Cecilia had never been his wife, and therefore neither was I, or it might say something else entirely. I did not understand the intricacies of such matters, and I was afraid to ask. That night, after Lily was asleep, I stood at my window and looked out at the moonlit gardens of Ashworth. The roses were silver in the pale light, their petals closed against the chill of the night air. Somewhere in the house, a clock was chiming the hour, and I counted the strokes without thinking. 11, 12, midnight. An owl called from the woods beyond the garden, and I heard the distant sound of hoofbeats on the road, some traveler making their way through the darkness to destinations unknown. I did not know what the future held. I did not know if the Duke would ever see me as more than the victim of his wife's deception, the rightful owner of a name and a child that had been stolen from her. But I knew that something had changed today in the rose garden. Some invisible line had been crossed. We were no longer strangers bound together by circumstance. We were something else, something I did not yet have a name for. And as I stood there in the darkness, watching the moon trace its arc across the sky, I allowed myself to hope that perhaps, after all the loss and all the pain, there might still be happiness waiting for me on the other side. I pressed my hand against the cool glass of the window and made a silent promise to myself. Whatever happened, whatever the future brought, I would not run from it. I had spent 5 years wandering in the wilderness of my own forgotten life. I would not spend another day hiding from the possibility of joy. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring. For now, it was enough to stand here in the moonlight and believe that the best was yet to come. Summer arrived at Ashworth in a blaze of golden light and fragrant blossoms, and with it came a change I had not anticipated. The Duke began to seek my company. It was subtle at first, easily dismissed as coincidence or courtesy. He would appear in the library when I was reading, claiming he needed a book from the upper shelves. He would join me in the garden when I was cutting flowers, offering to carry my basket. He would linger at the breakfast table long after his plate was empty, asking my opinion on matters of estate management or local politics. I told myself it meant nothing, that he was simply being kind to a woman who had nowhere else to go. But there was something in the way he looked at me, something in the softness that crept into his voice when we were alone, that made my heart beat faster, despite my attempts to keep it still. Lily noticed before I did. Children are perceptive in ways that adults often forget, and my daughter had spent 5 years watching the dynamics of a household built on lies. She knew what genuine affection looked like because she had so rarely seen it. "His Grace likes you, Mama," she said one afternoon as we sat together in the nursery, working on the sampler she had been stitching for weeks. "He smiles when you are in the room." "Does he?" I said, keeping my voice carefully neutral. I had not noticed. She gave me a look that was far too knowing for a child of 5. "You noticed," she said. "I can tell because your cheeks turn pink when he speaks to you." I had no answer to that. so I changed the subject to the pattern of her stitches. But her words stayed with me long after she had moved on to other topics. And that night I found myself examining my own feelings with the honesty I had been avoiding. I cared for him. More than cared. The man I had once thought cold and unfeeling had revealed himself to be something far more complex. A soul that had been wounded by loss and disappointment and had built walls to protect itself from further harm. I understood those walls because I had built my own. I understood the fear of opening oneself to love when love had brought nothing but pain. And I understood, with a clarity that frightened me, that I wanted to tear down those walls and see what lay behind them. But how could I tell him? How could I speak of love to a man who had been married to my sister, who had shared 5 years of his life with a woman who had deceived him in my name? Even if his marriage to Cecilia had been declared void, even if the law said he was free, would he ever be able to look at me without seeing the shadow of her betrayal? Would he ever be able to love me as myself and not as the woman he had thought he married? The answer came on the night of the midsummer ball. It was a tradition at Ashworth, the Duke told me, one that dated back generations. Every year on the longest day of summer, the great house opened its doors to the gentry of the surrounding counties, and the ballroom blazed with candlelight until dawn. His mother had loved the midsummer ball more than any other event of the social calendar, and he had continued the tradition in her memory even after her death. "This year," he said, "I would like you to serve as hostess." I stared at him, certain I had misheard. "Me? But I am not your wife. I have no standing in society. The scandal of my situation is known to everyone in the county. You are the widow of Captain Thomas Ashford," he said calmly. "You are the mother of the child who has been raised in this house as my stepdaughter. And you are the rightful mistress of Ashworth, whether society chooses to acknowledge it or not. I would be honored if you would stand beside me and welcome our guests." There was something in his voice, something that went beyond the formal words he was speaking. I searched his face for some clue to his meaning, but his expression was as unreadable as ever. "Very well," I said. "If you wish it, I will serve as your hostess." His smile, when it came, was like the sun breaking through clouds. "Thank you, Eleanor." It was the first time he had used my Christian name. The sound of it on his lips sent a shiver down my spine that had nothing to do with the cool evening breeze. The preparations for the ball consumed the following weeks. Mrs. Blackwood and I worked together to ensure that every detail was perfect, from the flowers that would adorn the tables to the menu that would be served at midnight supper. I threw myself into the work with a fervor that surprised even me, determined to prove that I was worthy of the trust the Duke had placed in me. I would not let him down. I would not let myself down. On the night of the ball, I stood before the mirror in my chambers and hardly recognized the woman who looked back at me. The gown was a gift from the Duke, delivered that morning with a note that said only, "For the hostess of Ashworth." It was silk the color of moonlight, with delicate embroidery at the bodice and a train that swept the floor behind me. My hair had been arranged by the Duchess's former lady's maid, now mine, in an elaborate style that made me look taller and more elegant than I had ever felt. Around my neck hung a single strand of pearls that had belonged to the Duke's mother. I looked like a duchess. For the first time in my life, I felt like one too. Lily came to see me before I went downstairs, and her eyes went wide with wonder. "You look like a princess, Mama," she breathed. "Like the princess in the fairy tales." I knelt down and gathered her in my arms, careful not to crush the silk of my gown. "You are the only princess I need," I said. "Now go to bed like a good girl, and tomorrow I will tell you all about the ball." She kissed my cheek and scampered off to the nursery, and I took a deep breath and made my way to the ballroom. The Duke was waiting for me at the foot of the grand staircase. He was dressed in formal evening attire, his dark coat perfectly tailored, his cravat tied with precision. But it was his face that stopped me in my tracks, the way he looked at me as I descended the stairs, as though he were seeing something he had been searching for all his life. "You are beautiful," he said, and his voice was rough with an emotion I could not name. Thank you, Your Grace, I managed. Edmund, he said. My name is Edmund. I would very much like you to use it. I felt the heat rise to my cheeks. Edmund, I repeated, and the name felt like a secret on my tongue. He offered me his arm, and together we walked into the ballroom. The sight that greeted us took my breath away. Thousands of candles blazed in crystal chandeliers, casting a warm golden glow over the assembled guests. The walls were draped with garlands of roses and jasmine, their fragrance mingling with the scent of beeswax and perfume. An orchestra played from a raised dais at the far end of the room, and couples were already taking their places on the polished floor, the ladies' gowns swirling like flower petals in a gentle wind. I had never seen anything so beautiful, and I had never felt more out of place or more determined to belong. The evening that followed was a blur of faces and names and conversations. I greeted the guests with a smile that became genuine as the night wore on, accepting their compliments and their curiosity with a grace I had not known I possessed. Some of them looked at me with suspicion, no doubt wondering about the scandal that had brought me here. Others looked at me with sympathy, or with admiration, or with the simple pleasure of meeting someone new. I treated them all the same, with courtesy and warmth, and by the time the orchestra struck up the first waltz, I felt as though I had been hostess of Ashworth all my life. Edmund claimed me for that first dance. He led me onto the floor with a confidence that brooked no refusal, and as the music swelled around us, he drew me into his arms and we began to move. I had not danced since my wedding to Thomas, and that had been a hurried affair with no orchestra and no ballroom, just the two of us swaying together in the parlor of the vicarage while my father played the pianoforte. This was different. This was music that swept through me like a tide, movement that felt as natural as breathing, a partner who held me as though I were something precious that he was afraid to break. You dance beautifully, he said. I had a good teacher, I said. My father believed that dancing was a form of prayer. Your father sounds like a wise man. He was, I said, and the memory of him brought a sweetness to my smile. He would have liked you, I think. He valued honesty above all else. Then he would have despised me for the 5 years I spent living with a lie, Edmund said, and there was a bitterness in his voice that made me tighten my grip on his shoulder. He would have understood, I said. We all make mistakes. It is what we do after we recognize them that defines us. The music carried us across the floor, past the watching eyes of the other guests, past the glittering chandeliers and the banks of flowers and the windows that looked out onto the moonlit gardens. For a moment, there was nothing in the world but the two of us, moving together in perfect harmony. Eleanor, he said, and his voice was low and urgent. There is something I must say to you. My heart stopped. What is it? He slowed our dance, bringing us to a halt in a quiet corner of the ballroom where the shadows hid us from curious eyes. His hands remained on my waist, and I could feel the warmth of them through the silk of my gown. When you first came to my house, he said, I thought you were a madwoman or a fortune hunter. I treated you with contempt because I was afraid that what you were saying might be true, afraid of what it would mean for my life, my marriage, everything I had built. I was a coward, and I am sorry. You have already apologized, I said. There is no need to do so again. There is every need, he said, because I am about to ask you something, and I want you to understand who I am before you answer. I am a man who has made mistakes, a man who chose comfort over truth, who closed his eyes to deception because it was easier than facing the darkness. I am not the hero of one of your fairy tales. I am flawed and broken and sometimes cold when I should be warm. But I am also a man who has learned from his failures. A man who knows now what he wants, what he needs, what he cannot live without. He took a breath, and I saw something in his eyes that I had never seen before. Vulnerability, hope, fear. "I love you, Eleanor," he said. "I have loved you since the moment I saw you kneeling on the floor of my kitchen, refusing to be dismissed. I love your strength and your kindness and the way you look at Lily as though she is the most precious thing in the world. I love the way you have brought this house back to life, the way you have brought me back to life. And I know I have no right to ask, but I am asking anyway. Will you stay? Not as a guest, not as the widow of my cousin, but as my wife, my true wife, the woman I choose, not because of a contract or a duty, but because I cannot imagine facing the rest of my days without you." The tears came before I could stop them, streaming down my cheeks in silver rivulets that I did not bother to wipe away. "Edmund," I said, and my voice broke on his name. "I have spent 5 years alone, 5 years without a home, without a name, without anyone who knew who I truly was. I had given up hope of ever being loved again. I had accepted that my life would be one of service and duty and quiet loneliness. And then I found you. I found Lily. I found this house that has become more of a home to me than anywhere I have ever lived. How could I possibly say no?" "Is that a yes?" he asked, and there was a tremor in his voice that made me love him even more. "It is a yes," I said. "It is the most certain yes I have ever spoken." He kissed me then, right there in the shadowed corner of the ballroom, while the orchestra played on and the guests danced without us. It was a kiss that tasted of joy and promise and the beginning of something new. It was a kiss that healed wounds I had carried for so long I had forgotten they were there. We were married in the autumn, when the leaves had turned to gold and crimson and the air was crisp with the promise of winter. It was a quiet ceremony in the chapel at Ashworth, just the two of us and Lily and the household staff who had become our family. The morning sun streamed through the stained glass windows, painting patterns of color on the stone floor, and somewhere outside, a bird was singing as though it too wished to celebrate. I wore a gown of ivory silk, and Edmund placed a ring on my finger that had belonged to his grandmother, a circle of sapphires that sparkled like stars against my skin. Lily stood beside us as we spoke our vows, her small hand clasped in mine, and when the vicar pronounced us husband and wife, she threw her arms around both of us and declared that she had never been so happy in all her life. Neither had I. The years that followed were not without their challenges. Society was slow to accept the scandal of our union, the tangled web of deception and revelation that had brought us together. There were whispers at parties and cold shoulders at balls, matrons who refused to receive me, and gentlemen who looked at Edmund with pity or scorn. But we weathered it together, hand in hand, and in time the whispers faded and the cold shoulders warmed. We had each other. We had Lily, who grew into a young woman of remarkable grace and intelligence. And in time, we had other children too, a son with his father's gray eyes and a daughter with my crescent moon birthmark on her shoulder. Ashworth became the home I had dreamed of all those years ago, when I was a vicar's daughter reading fairy tales by candlelight and imagining a life of love and adventure. It was not the life I had expected. It was better. I never saw Cecilia again. We received word, some years after her departure, that she had died of a fever in a small town in Virginia. I grieved for her, in my own way. She had been my sister, and despite everything she had done, there had been moments of kindness between us before the hunger consumed her. I hoped that she had found peace in the end, that the restless longing that had driven her to such terrible acts had finally been stilled. But mostly, I did not think of her at all. My life was too full for regret, too bright for shadows. I had my husband, who loved me with a steadfastness that still took my breath away after decades of marriage. I had my children, who filled the halls of Ashworth with laughter and noise and the beautiful chaos of growing up. I had my home, my name, my place in the world, and I had the memory of that winter night when I first walked through the gates of Ashworth, a woman with nothing but her determination and her love for a daughter she had never stopped searching for. I had lost everything once, and in losing it, I had found something I never knew I was looking for. I had found myself.